You know, there are certain stories that refuse to die. They don't need blood-soaked walls or dramatic confessions to haunt us. They don't rely on infamous killers leaving cryptic notes or police photographs splashed across newspapers. No, the most unsettling stories are often the simplest ones, the ones that leave behind nothing but a question so vast and hollow that it echoes through generations like a curse whispered in the dark. What you're about to hear is one of those stories, a tale that's been buried beneath Vermont snowfall, hidden between scripture pages, and wrapped in a silence so complete it screams louder than any violence ever could. Picture this: March 17, 1889, in the frozen valleys of Westmore, Vermont. The morning broke like any other under the heavy gray sky of the Green Mountains, where winter held the land in an iron grip that wouldn't loosen for weeks to come. Snow sat quietly on rooftops like a blanket of forgetting, and smoke curled from chimneys in lazy spirals that dissolved into the cold air. In the Blake household, nestled on the edge of the Willoughby Forest, it was Sunday, the Lord's Day, as it had been every week for the past 22 years. Thomas Blake and his family were preparing for their routine walk to the modest wooden church down the road, the same church where they'd sat in the same pew, sung the same hymns, and bowed their heads in the same prayers week after week without fail. Nothing seemed out of place that morning. There were no cries in the night, no mysterious messages slipped under doors, no strangers passing through town with dark intentions, just 12 members of a close-knit, God-fearing family going about their Sunday routine. 12 people who would never be seen again. Let that sink in for a moment. 12 human beings, men, women, and children, vanished from their home in the span of a few hours without leaving behind a single trace. No blood staining the floorboards, no bodies hidden in the cellar, no footprints leading away through the snow, no sounds of struggle that might have alerted the neighbors. An entire family simply ceased to exist between breakfast and church service. When concerned neighbors finally visited the farmhouse that Sunday evening, what they discovered was more perplexing than any scene of violence could have been. The fireplace still crackled with warmth, fresh logs half burned in the grate. In the kitchen, a pot roast continued cooking, untouched and still bubbling as if someone had just stepped away to fetch something from the pantry. Empty mugs of tea sat on the table alongside cutlery laid out neatly for dinner, a meal that was either just about to be served or had been abandoned mid-bite. Every coat remained on its hook by the door. Every pair of shoes sat lined up on the mat, dry and clean as if no one had ventured outside. Family Bibles lay open on chairs and tables, passages marked and ready for study, as if the morning prayer had simply been paused mid-verse with every intention of resuming. To anyone walking through that door, it would have looked like the family had just stepped out for a moment, maybe to check on the animals or gather firewood. But that moment stretched into hours, and those hours into days, and those days into headlines that spread across New England like wildfire. Eventually, even the headlines faded into an uncomfortable silence that settled over Westmore like another layer of snow. Here's what should make your skin crawl. That house, that modest Vermont farmhouse where all of this happened, stood empty for 14 years. Not because people couldn't afford it or didn't need the shelter, but because every single attempt to move in ended the same way. Families would last days, sometimes only hours, before fleeing with stories of creeping unease that started in their bones and worked its way out. They spoke of footsteps in the snow that appeared from nowhere and vanished mid-stride, of whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, of a woman's voice humming old hymns in rooms that had been empty for years. Eventually that house burned to the ground, and despite what some might tell you, it wasn't an accident. Even the fire couldn't provide closure, though. When investigators sifted through the ashes, they found nothing, not a single human bone, not a fragment of the family's belongings, nothing that might explain what happened to the Blakes. So we're left with questions that have no answers. How do 12 people, Thomas and Martha Blake, their 5 children ranging from 8 to 21 years old, Thomas's brother Henry visiting from Montpelier with his wife and their 2 young children, how do they all simply cease to exist in a matter of moments? How does a community so small and tightly knit that everyone knows everyone else's business have absolutely no clue what happened? How do you erase an entire family from reality without leaving behind even the faintest whisper of physical evidence? For over 130 years, the mystery of the Blake family disappearance hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown darker and more twisted with each passing decade. Questions have transformed into obsessions, theories have evolved into legends. Some say the family left willingly, called by something they couldn't resist. Others believe something ancient and hungry took them. There are even those who claim to have seen them still wandering near Lake Willoughby on certain winter nights, frozen in time, their lips moving in silent prayer, forever reciting the same verse from their prayer book. And then there are the records, those documents buried deep in the Vermont Historical Society's archives, containing details that were never released to the public. Paper clippings with entire sections blacked out, church logs with pages torn away, investigators' notes that end abruptly with no explanation. 3 different investigators who worked on the case either disappeared themselves or ended their days in asylums, raving about things that made no sense to anyone who would listen. Let me be clear, this isn't some internet ghost story or creepypasta cooked up for entertainment. The Blake family was real. They lived, they breathed, they left behind tax records and church donations and letters to relatives. Their disappearance was documented by multiple sources, investigated by law enforcement, examined by spiritualists from Boston and detectives from Montpelier who camped in those woods for weeks trying to find answers, prayer groups assembled to seek divine intervention, and yet nothing, absolutely nothing, brought anyone closer to the truth. Today, we're going back into that snow-covered silence, back to 1889 Vermont, back to a Sunday morning that started like any other and ended in impossible absence. We're not here seeking closure because there may be none to find. We're here to understand a different kind of dread, the kind that hides beneath ordinary Sunday routines and family prayers. We're here to listen to what little evidence remains and reconstruct a mystery that refuses to be solved. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see something that all those investigators missed. Because when 12 people vanish during their morning prayers in a town where everyone knows your name and your business and what you had for breakfast, it becomes more than just an unsolved case. It becomes a warning that the world we think we know, the reality we take for granted, might have cracks in it. Cracks wide enough for an entire family to fall through and never return. To truly grasp how an entire family could vanish without leaving so much as a footprint, you need to understand the world they inhabited, a world that might as well be on another planet compared to our modern, connected existence. Vermont in 1889 was a place caught between 2 ages, with one foot planted firmly in the old world of superstition and soil, and the other tentatively stepping toward the industrial future that was transforming America's cities. But in the rural northern reaches of the state, in places like Westmore, that future felt as distant as the moon. Westmore sat like a forgotten jewel in Orleans County, cradled between the dramatic cliffs of Mount Pisgah and Mount Hor, with Lake Willoughby stretching between them like a mirror of black glass. The landscape was breathtaking in its severity, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. During the brutal winters, which could last from October to May, the town became an island unto itself. Roads narrowed to barely navigable tracks, often completely impassable for days after heavy snowfall. Electricity was still a urban curiosity. Telephones were virtually unheard of, and news traveled at the speed of horseback or gossip, whichever was faster. The isolation was complete and crushing. When snow fell heavy, entire families could be cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. If something terrible happened during those long, dark months, evidence could be buried under feet of snow within hours, swallowed by the landscape as if it had never existed at all. Nature itself could be judge, jury, and executioner, leaving no witnesses except the wind and trees. But despite this isolation, or perhaps because of it, Westmore wasn't a lawless place. The town's 140 or so residents lived by strict codes of behavior, most of them centered around the church. There was no jail because there was rarely need for one. The general store, the butcher, the blacksmith, one overworked doctor, and 24 farming families made up the entirety of the community. Everyone knew everyone else's business, from who was courting whom to whose cow had gone dry. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford, and deviation from accepted behavior was noticed immediately and discussed endlessly. Life revolved around 3 pillars: land, livestock, and the Lord. Children were born at home with the help of midwives, Illness was treated with prayer first and medicine second, and death was met with stoic acceptance and proper Christian burial. But it was Sunday that truly defined the rhythm of life in Westmore. Church attendance wasn't just expected, it was as essential as breathing. To miss service without good reason was to invite scrutiny that could last for months. Even being late could set tongues wagging for weeks. This is the world the Blake family inhabited, and by all accounts they inhabited it well. Thomas Blake, 52 years old at the time of the disappearance, was what people in those days called a man of substance. He'd earned his respect the hard way, carrying a Union rifle through some of the Civil War's bloodiest battles. His letters home from 1864, preserved in various archives, paint a picture of a thoughtful, deeply religious man who saw his survival as a debt owed to God, a debt he intended to repay through righteous living. After the war, Thomas returned to Westmore with a slight limp from a Confederate bullet and a determination to build something lasting. He married Martha LeClaire, a schoolteacher from nearby Charleston, whose intelligence and gentle manner made her a natural match for the contemplative veteran. Together, they built their farmhouse near the southern tree line of Lake Willoughby, choosing a spot where the land was fertile and the view stretched for miles across the water. Local records show they were neither the richest nor the poorest family in town, but they were among the most respected. Quiet, kinder folk, neighbors called them, people who paid their debts, helped their neighbors, and never missed church. Their 5 children were raised with the same values. Abigail, the eldest at 21, was following in her mother's footsteps, training to become a school teacher. She was known for her beautiful singing voice and her patience with younger children. Henry Jr., 18, was his father's right hand on the farm, a strong young man who neighbors said could have his pick of the local girls when he decided to court. Elijah, 15, was the quiet one, more interested in books than farming, with hopes of attending seminary school. Josephine, 12, was the artist of the family, always sketching or working on needlepoint, and little Thomas Jr., just 8 years old, had recently begun his lessons with the parish priest, showing the same quick mind as his mother. The week of their disappearance had brought an unusual addition to the household. Thomas's younger brother, Henry Blake Sr., had arrived from Montpelier with his wife Clara and their 2 children, aged 6 and 10. It was a rare family reunion, the first time in 3 years that the brothers had been together. Henry Sr. worked as a clerk in the state capital, and the contrast between his city ways and his brother's rural life had been a source of good-natured ribbing throughout the visit. Neighbors who saw them on Saturday evening reported a household full of warmth and laughter, children playing, adults sharing stories, the kind of family gathering that makes people smile to witness. The plan for Sunday morning was simple and typical. Given the size of the group and the harsh weather, they would conduct morning prayers at home before walking together to church for the main service. This wasn't unusual. Many families with young children or elderly members would hold private devotions before making the trek to church, especially during winter months. Several neighbors confirmed seeing smoke from the Blake chimney that morning, steady and normal, the sign of a house old awake and preparing for the day. But here's where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where routine transforms into mystery, because in a place like Westmore, where everyone knew everyone else's schedule down to the minute, where the sound of the church bell regulated life like a heartbeat, the absence of 12 people wasn't just noticed, it was immediately, viscerally wrong. When the Blake family pew sat empty that morning, when the bell rang its final call, and still no Blakes appeared, the congregation didn't just wonder where they were. They knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from decades of unchanging routine that something terrible had happened. The church service that morning was a stuttering, distracted affair. The pastor, Father Anselm Royce, kept glancing at the empty pew as if expecting the family to materialize at any moment. He'd known the Blakes for 17 years, had baptized their children, had prayed with Thomas through his war memories and with Martha through difficult births. Their absence was like a missing tooth, impossible to ignore. When he finally gave up and began the service 15 minutes late, itself an unprecedented delay, the whispers had already begun rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat. By the time the service ended, 2 neighbors had already volunteered to check on the family. Samuel Witter, the local blacksmith, and Esther Wainwright, a widow who'd been Martha's closest friend, set out on the mile-long walk to the Blake farm. What they expected to find was illness, perhaps, or some minor emergency that had kept the family home. What they actually found would transform a simple welfare check into the opening chapter of Vermont's most enduring mystery. Because the Blake family hadn't just missed church, they hadn't overslept or taken ill or decided to stay home. They had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a house that looked for all the world like they'd just stepped out for a moment that has now stretched on for more than a century, with no sign of ending. The snow was falling again that Sunday afternoon, March 17, 1889, as Samuel Witter and Esther Wainwright made their way along the narrow path to the Blake farmhouse. It was the kind of snow that falls in late winter, heavy, wet, almost reluctant, as if the sky itself was tired of the season. Esther would later tell investigators that she felt something wrong in her chest from the moment they left the church, a tightness that had nothing to do with the cold air or the uphill walk. She'd sat beside Martha Blake every Sunday for 16 years, their shoulders almost touching in the narrow pew, their voices blending during hymns. The empty space beside her that morning had felt like a wound. Samuel, ever the practical man, tried to reassure her as they walked. The Blakes had visitors after all. Perhaps one of the children had taken ill during the night. Perhaps the reunion had run late, and they'd simply overslept. But even as he spoke these reasonable words, he found himself studying the path ahead with growing unease. As a blacksmith, Samuel knew tracks. He could read the story of every horse, wagon, and boot that passed his shop, and what he saw in the fresh snow that morning made no sense at all. The path to the Blake farm showed no recent footprints except their own. No wagon wheels, no horse hooves, no sign that anyone had traveled this way since the snow began falling the previous evening. They reached the Blake property at approximately 1:45 p.m., and the first thing they noticed was how utterly normal everything appeared. The family's wagon sat in its usual spot under the awning, lightly dusted with snow. Smoke still rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, suggesting the fire had been tended recently. The barn door was closed but not barred, and through the gaps in the wood they could hear the restless movement of animals, unusual for this time of day when they should have been let out to pasture. But it was the front door that made Samuel stop in his tracks. It stood slightly ajar, perhaps an inch or two, moving gently in the breeze. In our modern world, an open door might mean nothing. But in rural Vermont in 1889, during a harsh winter, leaving a door open was more than careless. It was dangerous. It meant letting in cold that could kill, wasting precious firewood, inviting death into your home. Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the snow-muffled landscape. "Thomas? Martha? Anyone home?" The words seemed to fall into a void, swallowed by a silence so complete it felt almost aggressive. They entered the house slowly, calling out as they went, and what they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The scene that greeted them was one of perfect domestic tranquility, frozen at the moment of interruption. The main room was warm, the fireplace crackling with logs that couldn't have been added more than an hour or two ago. The kitchen table was set for 12, with plates of food still warm enough to release wisps of steam into the air. A pot of stew bubbled gently on the stove, its aroma filling the house with the comfortable smell of Sunday dinner. But it was the details that made the scene truly unsettling. Forks rested on plates with food still speared on their tines. Cups of tea sat half-drunk, some still faintly warm to the touch. Chairs were pulled out from the table at angles that suggested people had risen quickly but not urgently. There was no sign of overturned furniture or scattered belongings that might indicate panic. In the parlor, 4 Bibles lay open at different passages, family members' names written in the margins, ribbons marking pages, as if study had been interrupted mid-verse. Samuel and Esther moved through the house like people in a dream, each room revealing new impossibles. Ites. All the family's coats hung on their hooks by the door. How could they have left in this weather without coats? Their boots stood in neat rows on the mat, dry and clean. In Thomas and Martha's bedroom, the bed was unmade but not disheveled, as if they'd risen normally that morning. The children's rooms showed similar signs of ordinary morning activity. Beds left unmade, nightclothes folded on chairs, everything exactly as it should be, except for the absence of the children themselves. On Thomas Blake's desk in the small study, they found perhaps the most chilling detail of all. A letter to Father Royce sat half-finished, the ink fresh enough that it couldn't have been written more than a few hours ago. It discussed plans for a church fundraising event, written in Thomas's careful hand, stopping mid-sentence. "I believe we could raise sufficient funds if we were to organize a—" The pen lay beside the paper as if he'd simply paused to think of the next word. But it was the clock that made Esther gasp and clutch at her cross. The family's prized possession, a beautiful wooden clock that had been a wedding gift to Thomas and Martha, had stopped at exactly 9:12 a.m. In a house where everything else seemed frozen in a moment of normal activity, this felt deliberate, meaningful, though neither visitor could say why. The dining room held the final and perhaps most disturbing detail. Propped against a loaf of fresh-baked bread sat the family Bible, open to the book of Ezekiel. A dark red ribbon marked a passage that someone had underlined in what looked like fresh ink or charcoal. The verse read, "And I will bring them down into the pit, and they shall be no more." Esther took one look at those words and backed out of the room, making the sign of the cross and refusing to enter again. She would later tell investigators that the air in that room felt different, thicker, older, as if it belonged to another time entirely. Samuel, trying to maintain his composure, searched the rest of the property. The barn revealed more puzzles. The animals, cows, several chickens, and the family's plow horse were all present but clearly distressed. They hadn't been fed or watered that morning, unusual for a family as methodical as the Blakes. The family dog, a loyal creature that followed young Henry Jr. everywhere, was nowhere to be found. No tracks led away from the barn, no sign of struggle or disturbance. Even the hay in the loft lay undisturbed. As word spread through the community, more neighbors arrived. By evening, 18 people had walked through the Blake house, each adding their own observations to the growing list of impossibilities. Mary Patterson noticed that young Josephine's sketching materials were laid out on her bedroom floor, a half-finished drawing of the view from her window abandoned mid-stroke. John Hartwell, who knew Thomas's habits well, pointed out that the man's pipe sat on the mantel still warm, tobacco pouch open beside it. Sarah Mills found Martha's knitting in a basket by her chair, needles still inserted in the work as if she'd just set it down for a moment. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came from young Timothy Crane, a boy of 14 who'd been friends with Elijah Blake. While the adults congregated in the main rooms, Timothy ventured upstairs and found something that made him cry out. In Elijah's room, pressed against the window, were handprints on the glass. Small handprints, child-sized but positioned at least 7 feet off the ground, far too high for any child to reach without a ladder. And there was no ladder in the room. Sheriff Marcus Dole arrived from the county seat the following day and began the official investigation. His notes, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society, reveal a man struggling to make sense of the senseless. He wrote, "The scene presents as if the entire family was removed between one heartbeat and the next, not fled, removed. The distinction feels important, though I cannot say why." He noted the complete absence of struggle, the lack of any missing valuables, the food still warm hours after it should have cooled. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of tracks leading away from the house in any direction. The sheriff ordered a thorough search of the property. The root cellar was examined, the well was checked, even the privy was investigated. Nothing. No signs of violence, no hidden bodies, no secret passages. The house stood as a perfect tableau of interrupted life, offering no clues as to where 12 people had gone or why. Even the family's money, a small sum kept in a tin in the kitchen, remained untouched. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Several neighbors reported that in the days following the disappearance, they heard sounds coming from the empty house, children laughing, a woman humming hymns, the creak of rocking chairs. But whenever anyone investigated, they found only silence and emptiness. Others spoke of seeing lights in the windows at night, though no one was brave enough to enter after dark to investigate. One detail recorded in Deputy Hiram Lewis's personal notes but never included in the official report stands out for its strangeness. Under the floorboards in the children's bedroom, he found a series of symbols carved into the wood, not random scratches but deliberate markings that looked almost like a language, though not one anyone recognized. He made sketches of these symbols, but they were never explained, and Lewis himself left Vermont within 2 years, moving to Illinois and changing his name. The Blake house stood empty after that day, a wound in the fabric of the community that refused to heal. Every attempt to inhabit it failed. Families would last days, sometimes only hours, before fleeing with tales of footsteps in empty rooms, whispers in the walls, and always, the sound of a woman humming hymns that no one could quite identify. The house became a place to avoid, especially after dark, highly in winter, especially on Sunday mornings when some claimed you could still hear the family preparing for church, still hear the clock ticking toward 9:12, still hear the silence that fell when that moment arrived. What happened in those morning hours remains unknown. 12 people don't simply vanish from a locked house without coats in a Vermont winter. They don't leave meals half-eaten and letters half-written. They don't disappear without footprints or wagon tracks or any sign of where they've gone. And yet that's exactly what the Blake family did, leaving behind only questions that echo through time like their own abandoned prayers, forever unanswered, forever asking, where did they go? And perhaps more importantly, what took them? By Monday morning, March 18, 1889, the disappearance of the Blake family had transformed from a local concern into a full-scale investigation that would draw in resources from across Orleans County and beyond. Sheriff Marcus Dole, a man who'd seen his share of violence and tragedy in his 20 years of law enforcement, arrived at the Blake farmhouse with a team that included 2 deputies, the local pastor Father Anselm Royce, and most importantly, Daniel Clark, a tracker whose reputation for finding lost hunters and missing livestock was legendary throughout northern Vermont. If anyone could read the story written in snow and earth, it was Clark. What followed was perhaps the most thorough search ever conducted in Orleans County up to that time. Every inch of the Blake property was examined with methodical precision. The farmhouse was literally taken apart. Floorboards were pried up, walls were tapped for hollow spaces, the root cellar was excavated, even the chimney was examined for any signs of foul play. The barn received similar treatment, with hay bales moved, stalls dismantled, and the ground beneath checked for any signs of recent digging. Nothing, not a drop of blood, not a strand of hair out of place, not a single indication that violence had visited this home. Daniel Clark's findings, or rather his lack of findings, proved the most disturbing element of all. After spending half a day examining the property's perimeter, tracking through the surrounding woods and following the shoreline of Lake Willoughby, he reached a conclusion that defied logic. There were no tracks leading away from the house, except those made by the search parties. The snowfall on Saturday night had been light, but sufficient to capture any footprints made after roughly 8 p.m. If the Blake family had left their home on foot after that time, they had somehow done so without touching the ground. Clark expanded his search, checking for signs that perhaps the family had left earlier on Saturday, and the witnesses who claimed to have seen them that evening were mistaken. But this theory crumbled against the physical evidence: the warm fireplace, the fresh food, Thomas's letter written in ink that couldn't have been more than hours old. Whatever had happened to the Blakes had happened Sunday morning during or after their morning prayers, and it had happened without them taking a single step outside their home. By March 21st, the investigation had expanded dramatically. 42 men from across the region formed search parties that swept through the forests, checked every hunting cabin and abandoned structure within 10 miles, and even broke through the ice at several points on Lake Willoughby to check for bodies beneath. The entire operation was conducted with military precision, with searchers walking arm's length apart through the woods to ensure no area was missed. They found nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a dropped possession, not even the family dog that had vanished along with its owners. As days turned into weeks with no progress, theories began to proliferate like weeds in an untended garden. Each attempted to explain the unexplainable, and each ultimately failed to account for all the evidence, or lack thereof. The first and perhaps most persistent theory was that the family had fallen victim to some form of religious mania. The biblical passage left open on the dining table, "They shall be no more," was interpreted by many as a suicide note of sorts. Perhaps, some suggested, the Blakes had been influenced by one of the apocalyptic religious movements that occasionally swept through New England. Maybe they had walked into Lake Willoughby in some form of baptismal death ritual, believing they were ascending to heaven. Father Royce fought against this theory with every fiber of his being. In letters to investigators and newspaper editors, he insisted that the Blakes were traditional Baptists with no history of radical beliefs. He'd known them for 17 years, had discussed theology with Thomas countless times, had never heard a whisper of anything beyond mainstream Protestant doctrine. Moreover, the practical problems with this theory were insurmountable. How had 12 people, including young children, walked to the lake without leaving footprints? Why leave coats behind in freezing weather? And why had extensive searches of the lake, including breaking through ice at multiple points, revealed nothing? The second major theory involved abduction by force. Several witnesses came forward claiming to have seen suspicious strangers in the area in the weeks before the disappearance. A drifter matching various descriptions had been spotted in nearby towns, asking questions about wealthy farmers and showing particular interest in isolated homesteads. This led to the arrest of Emil Hargreaves, a disturbed veteran who'd been discharged from the military for erratic behavior. But Hargreaves had an airtight alibi. He'd been in custody in Barton for unpaid debts since March 15th, 2 days before the Blakes vanished. Investigators pursued the abduction theory from every angle. Could a group of criminals have somehow subdued 12 people without a struggle? Could they have forced the family into wagons and driven them away? But again, the physical evidence refused to cooperate. No wagon tracks, no signs of struggle, no dropped items along any route away from the house. And what criminal gang would take the time to underline biblical passages or stop clocks at specific times? What profit was there in kidnapping an entire family of modest means while leaving their money untouched? As conventional theories failed, unconventional ones began to take their place. The area around Lake Willoughby had long been associated with strange phenomena. The Abenaki people who'd lived in the region for centuries before European settlement had their own stories about the lake and surrounding mountains. They spoke of places where the veil between worlds grew thin, where people could step from this reality into another as easily as walking through a doorway. The southern shore of the lake where the Blake farm sat was particularly noted in their oral traditions as a place of power and danger. These indigenous stories found unexpected support from other disappearances in the region. Between 1860 and 1902, official records show at least 4 other cases of multiple people vanishing without explanation within 15 miles of Lake Willoughby. The Pemberton family in 1867, 5 people gone from a logging camp with dinner still warm on the table. The Thorne sisters in 1878. 3 women who vanished while gathering herbs, leaving behind baskets half-filled and no footprints leading away. Each case bore striking similarities to the Blake disappearance. No signs of struggle, no bodies ever found, and always that eerie sense of lives interrupted mid-action. Local folklore began to weave these disappearances into a pattern. Some spoke of the lake calling to certain families, drawing them into its depths through means beyond physical understanding. Others whispered about ancient curses, dimensional doorways, or places where time itself grew unstable. The more educated scoffed at such tales, but even they had to admit that the conventional explanations made no more sense than the supernatural ones. A particularly unsettling theory emerged from the testimony of Sarah Hutchins, an elderly woman who'd lived in Westmore all her life. She claimed that disappearances like the Blakes followed a pattern. They happened every 12 to 17 years, always involved multiple people, always occurred near water, and always left behind the same signature. Lives interrupted so suddenly that food remained warm and clocks stopped at the moment of vanishing. She produced a handwritten journal kept by her grandmother documenting similar events going back to the 1790s. While historians couldn't verify all her claims, enough matched official records to send chills down investigative spines. Modern researchers have added their own theories to the mix. Some point to the unique geological composition of the area. The mountains around Lake Willoughby are rich in quartz and magnetic minerals that some believe could create electromagnetic anomalies. These anomalies, they suggest, might occasionally produce phenomena we don't yet understand, temporal distortions, dimensional rifts, or other exotic effects that could explain how 12 people could vanish without a trace. Others have drawn connections to the broader phenomenon of mysterious disappearances in wilderness areas, sometimes called the missing 411 phenomenon. These cases share certain characteristics. They occur in areas with unusual geology, often near water, involve people who vanish in impossible ways, and leave behind scenes of normal activity suddenly interrupted. The Blake case fits these pattern perfectly, suggesting to some researchers that whatever happened to them might be part of a larger, still unexplained phenomenon. But perhaps the most chilling theory came from Sheriff Dole himself. In his final report, filed weeks after the investigation had officially ended with no resolution, he wrote something that his superiors found so disturbing they nearly removed it from the official record. He suggested that the family hadn't been taken at all. They had been removed from time itself, caught in what he called a moment between moments. He cited the stopped clock, the interrupted activities, the food still warm hours after it should have cooled, as evidence that something had fundamentally disrupted the normal flow of time in the Blake house that morning. Whatever the truth, by April 1889 the official investigation was quietly closed. No bodies were ever found, no suspects were ever charged, no explanation was ever offered that could account for all the evidence. The Blake family had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions that multiplied with each passing year. The house stood empty, a monument to the impossible, while theories proliferated like shadows at dusk, each one darker than the last, none bringing anyone closer to understanding what had happened on that Sunday morning when 12 people stepped out of reality and never stepped back. As the last snows of winter melted into the mud of spring, the mystery of the Blake family didn't fade with the changing seasons. Instead, it spread through New England like a contagion of unease. The people of Westmore, once comfortable in their small-town routines, found themselves living in a community transformed by absence. Farmers who had chatted freely over fence posts now hurried past each other with brief nods. Mothers kept their children close, no longer allowing them to wander the woods alone. Doors that had stood unlocked for generations now bore heavy bolts, and windows that had welcomed morning light were shuttered against more than just the cold. The Orleans County Chronicle was first to break the story beyond Westmore's borders. On March 24, 1889, journalist Charles H. Pemberton published a front-page article that would become the definitive early account of the disappearance. His headline read simply, "Vanished, 12 souls lost in the frost, the Blake family mystery." The article itself was remarkably restrained, focusing on facts rather than speculation. The state of the house, the absence of evidence, the timeline of discovery. But Pemberton's personal diary, discovered decades later in his estate, reveals the toll the story took on him. In an entry dated April 2nd, he wrote something that his editor would never have allowed in print. "I've covered murders, accidents, all manner of human tragedy. But the Blake house was different. There was no death there, only absence. A holy kind of absence. As if God himself had reached down and plucked them from existence not in anger, but with terrible purpose." Within a week, the story had spread like wildfire. The Montpelier Argus picked it up, then the Burlington Free Press, and soon papers from Boston to New York were running their own versions, each more sensationalized than the last. "A family consumed by the mist," screamed one headline. "The day Westmore was cursed," proclaimed another. But it was the New York Herald that truly opened the floodgates with their Gothic reimagining titled "The Ghost Flock of Willoughby Lake." In their version, the Blakes weren't missing. They were transformed, turned into spirits by an ancient curse, doomed to wander the lakeshore for eternity. The article was pure fiction dressed as journalism, but it sold thousands of copies and turned Westmore into an unwilling tourist destination. By early April, the quiet Vermont town found itself invaded by a peculiar army of curiosity seekers, spiritualists, and self-proclaimed experts in the supernatural. They arrived in carriages and on horseback, dressed in city clothes wholly unsuited to rural life, carrying everything from Bibles to dowsing rods. Vera Mallory, a medium who claimed to have contacted the spirits of the Romanov family, set up camp outside the Blake property with great fanfare. She insisted the family had been called across the veil and that their voices could be heard crying out from silver mirrors in candlelight. When authorities refused her access to the house, she simply conducted her seances from a tent on the roadside, charging curious locals and visitors alike for the privilege of potentially communicating with the vanished family. The invasion of spiritualists brought with it a carnival atmosphere that horrified longtime residents. Photographers offered to take pictures of people standing where the Blakes had last been seen. Vendors sold blessed water from Lake Willoughby that they claimed could protect against whatever had taken the family. One enterprising charlatan even offered tours of the cursed grounds, despite having no actual access to the property. The Blake farmhouse, once a symbol of quiet domesticity, had become a sideshow attraction. Boston newspapers, particularly those with a more educated readership, took a different approach. They mocked the rural superstitions and spiritual hysteria with headlines like "The Blake Seance Bonanza" and "12 Strong and One Hell of a Story." Editorial writers suggested that the family had simply left to escape debts or start a new life elsewhere, and that the locals were either too simple or too stubborn to accept this obvious explanation. One particularly condescending piece in the Boston Globe suggested that the isolation of rural Vermont has clearly affected the reasoning capabilities of its inhabitants, who would rather believe in ghostly abductions than face mundane realities. But even the mockery couldn't explain away the testimonies of respectable citizens who had known the Blakes personally. When pressed by reporters, these witnesses didn't retreat into superstition. They simply repeated what they had seen and refused to speculate beyond the facts. Samuel Witter, the blacksmith who had discovered the empty house, told one persistent journalist, "I know what I saw. Food still warm, no footprints in the snow, 12 people gone. You explain it if you're so smart." His simple dignity in the face of urban condescension won more believers than any sensational story could have. The most disturbing aspect of the media coverage was how it revealed the complete absence of any logical motive for the disappearance. Investigative journalists from major papers dug into the Blake family's background, looking for hidden scandals, secret debts, or enemies who might wish them harm. They found nothing. The family's finances were modest but stable. There were no inheritance disputes, no romantic entanglements, no business rivalries. Thomas Blake's war record was exemplary. Martha Blake's reputation was spotless. Even the children, scrutinized for any hint of trouble, emerged as model young people. The harder journalists looked for a rational explanation. The more the irrational ones seemed to gain credibility. Sheriff Marcus Dole found himself at the center of the media storm, pressed constantly for updates on an investigation that had stalled completely. In one memorable exchange with a reporter from the New York Times, he was asked if he believed the family had met with foul play. His response, published verbatim, sent chills through readers. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years. I know what murder looks like, smells like, feels like when you walk into a room where it's happened. The Blake house didn't have any of that. It had something else, some thing I don't have words for. If you want to call it supernatural, I won't argue. I just know it wasn't anything I was trained to handle." The effect on Westmore itself was devastating. The town split into factions, those who embraced the attention and possible economic benefits of tourism, those who wanted all outsiders gone, and those who simply wanted their quiet life back. Church attendance, paradoxically, both rose and fell. Some sought comfort in faith, packing the pews to capacity. Others, shaken by the disappearance of such a devout family, found their beliefs crumbling. Father Royce tried desperately to hold his congregation together, but the strain showed. His sermons became increasingly focused on maintaining faith in the face of the inexplicable, but even he couldn't provide the answers people desperately sought. The Vermont Historical Society began quietly collecting every piece of documentation related to the case: newspaper clippings, witness testimonies, investigative reports, even the wild theories of visiting spiritualists. They created a special collection that would eventually fill several boxes, a paper monument to a mystery that refused to be solved. But even as they preserved these records, society officials noticed something troubling. Several documents would go missing only to reappear days later in different files. Pages would be found torn out of bound volumes with no explanation. One librarian swore she saw handwriting appear on a blank page while she was cataloging materials, though no one believed her. As summer arrived and the immediate frenzy began to die down, Westmore tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the damage was done. The town's innocence, its sense of safety and predictability had vanished as surely as the Blake family. Properties near the lake lost value as buyers stayed away. Young people began leaving for cities, unwilling to remain in a place marked by such inexplicable loss. The Blake farmhouse stood empty, a wound in the landscape that no one could heal or ignore. The media attention heartburn had transformed a local tragedy into a national mystery, but in doing so, it had also transformed the mystery into something larger and stranger than anyone could have imagined. Because now it wasn't just about 12 missing people, it was about what their disappearance said about the nature of reality itself. If a family could vanish from a locked house without a trace, if all our modern understanding and investigation could yield nothing but questions, then what else might be possible? What other impossibilities might be waiting in the shadows of ordinary life? The newspapers eventually moved on to other stories. The spiritualists found other mysteries to exploit, and the curious tourists found other destinations. But in Westmore, the questions remained, carved into the community's consciousness like those strange symbols found under the Blake children's floorboards, indecipherable, undeniable, and absolutely refusing to fade away. Time has a peculiar way of transforming tragedy, smoothing rough edges and dulling sharp pains until only stories remain. But the Blake family disappearance refuses to follow this pattern. Like a wound that won't heal, it has festered in the collective memory of Vermont for over a century, growing stranger and more disturbing with each passing generation. What began as a local tragedy has evolved into something far more unsettling, a permanent question mark carved into the landscape of New England, a reminder that our understanding of reality might be far more fragile than we dare to admit. Today, if you drive through Westmore, you won't find the Blake name on any mailbox or storefront. Whatever extended family might have survived through distant cousins or relatives never returned to this corner of Orleans County. The land where their farmhouse once stood has been thoroughly reclaimed by forest, as if nature itself conspired to erase the last physical evidence of their existence. But absence, as the Blakes themselves proved, can be more powerful than presence. Their story has become part of the region's DNA, woven into its folklore so deeply that it's impossible to extract. The early 20th century brought its own strange additions to the Blake legacy. Hikers and hunters passing through the area began reporting experiences that defied easy explanation. A woman's voice humming hymns where no woman should be. Children's laughter echoing from empty clearings. Most unsettling were the footprints, small child-sized impressions that would appear in fresh snow, follow a path for 30 or 40 feet, then simply stop mid-stride. No track leading away, no sign of where the walker had gone. These prints were always found in the same general area, between where the Blake house had stood and the shore of Lake Willoughby, and always during late March or early April, around the anniversary of the disappearance. Local newspapers dutifully recorded these incidents, usually burying them in back pages with headlines like "Strange Tracks Puzzle Hunters" or "Unusual Sounds Reported Near Willoughby." But patterns began to emerge for those who paid attention. The freezing spots, sudden localized drops in temperature that had no meteorological explanation. The sensation of being watched that drove experienced woodsmen to abandon camping trips. The way compasses would spin wildly in certain spots, as if the magnetic field itself had been twisted into unnatural shapes. Then came the fire of 1903. 14 years after the Blakes vanished, their abandoned farmhouse burned to the ground in what official reports called a lightning strike. But witnesses told a different story. Sarah Mills, who lived on a neighboring farm, swore she saw lights moving inside the house in the hour before it burned. Impossible, since no one had entered the property in years. Others reported hearing voices, maybe singing, maybe crying, as the flames consumed the saint. Rupture. The volunteer fire brigade that responded found something that the official report omitted, but that leaked out through whispered conversations. No remains in the ashes. Not just no human remains. No furniture, no metal implements, no stone foundation. The fire had burned so hot and so strangely that it left nothing but fine ash, as if the house had been not just burned but erased. The burning of the house marked a turning point. What had been a place of pilgrimage for the curious became a void that even locals avoided. But the mystery persisted, evolved, spread like spores on the wind. The Vermont Historical Society, in their quiet, methodical way, continued collecting every scrap of information related to the case. Their archives reveal a pattern of inquiry that spans decades. Letters from amateur investigators, reports from psychic researchers, even correspondence from foreign academics who had heard of the case and saw parallels to disappearances in their own countries. One document in particular stands out. A torn piece of parchment discovered in the Society's files in 1923 with no record of how it got there. Written in what appears to be a child's hand are the words, "They shall not suffer, only vanish." The paper itself was dated to the 1880s based on its composition, but no one could explain its presence or meaning. It remains in the collection, sealed in protective covering, a tangible link to an intangible mystery. As the 20th century progressed, the Blake story underwent a curious transformation in local culture. Children in Westmore began playing a game called the Blake 12, a dare that persists to this day. The rules are simple and chilling. Go to the southern shore of Lake Willoughby after midnight, stand alone in the darkness, and speak aloud the names of all 12 vanished family members. If you complete the recitation in silence, you're safe. But if you hear humming or footsteps, or worst of all, a response to your call, you run, and you don't look back. Most dismiss it as harmless folklore, a way for teenagers to scare each other. But over the years, there have been incidents. Young people who took the dare and came back changed. Not injured, not crazy, just different. Quieter, more serious. When pressed about what they experienced, they typically refused to speak about it. One girl, Emma Thorne, who took the dare in 1967, said only, "They're still there. Not here, but there. I could hear them trying to come back." She left Westmore the following year and never returned. The academic world hasn't ignored the Blake case either. In 1979, Dr. Miriam Letta from the University of Vermont published what remains the most comprehensive study of the disappearance. Her paper, Where the Snow Forgot, the Blake family disappearance of 1889, approached the mystery with scientific rigor, cataloging every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every theory, no matter how outlandish. Her conclusion was as unsettling as the case itself. She wrote, "The Blake case resists all conventional analysis, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence we have points to something outside our understanding. Either we accept that our knowledge of physical reality is incomplete, or we dismiss the testimony of dozens of credible witnesses. Neither option is comfortable, but comfort is not what this case offers. Modern technology has been brought to bear on the mystery with frustrating results. Ground-penetrating radar has found no buried remains. Metal detectors have discovered nothing more interesting than old horseshoes and fence posts. Psychics and paranormal investigators with electromagnetic field detectors and infrared cameras have captured anomalies, cold spots, energy spikes, unexplained shadows, but nothing definitive. The area where the Blake farm stood shows unusual magnetic properties, possibly due to mineral deposits. But whether this has any connection to the disappearance remains speculation. What makes the Blake legacy truly persistent is how it defies the usual pattern of historical mysteries. Most either get solved eventually through new evidence or fade into obscurity as witnesses die and interest wanes. The Blake case does neither. It remains as inexplicable today as it was in 1889, and interest rather than fading seems to regenerate with each generation. Online forums dedicated to unexplained disappearances frequently feature threads about the Blakes, with users sharing theories ranging from the plausible to the bizarre. Some connect it to other mysterious vanishings around the world. Others see it as evidence of parallel dimensions, time slips, or alien abduction. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blake legacy is found not in what we've discovered, but in what continues to happen. Every few years, someone else vanishes in the Lake Willoughby area under circumstances that echo the original disappearance. Never 12 people at once again, but individuals or pairs who simply step out of existence. A hiker in 1994 whose tent was found with breakfast half-eaten and no tracks leading away. A couple in 2006 whose car was discovered at a scenic overlook, engine still running, doors locked from the inside, no sign of where they'd gone. Each time, investigators note the similarities to the Blake case. Each time, they find no answers. The Blake family left behind no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no closure for those who knew them. But they left something else, a crack in our understanding of the world, a reminder that the universe operates by rules we haven't fully grasped. Their farmhouse is gone, their belongings scattered or destroyed, their faces preserved only in fading photographs. But their absence remains as present as ever, a hollow space in the fabric of reality that refuses to be filled or forgotten. In Westmore today, if you mention the Blakes to older residents, you'll likely get one of two reactions. Some will shake their heads and change the subject, treating the topic like a family shame best not discussed. Others will get a distant look in their eyes and tell you quietly that on certain nights, when the wind is just right and the lake is still as glass, you can still hear them. Not ghosts, they'll insist, but something else. Echoes of people caught between moments, trying to find their way back to a world that has moved on without them. Whether you believe them or not, one thing remains certain. The Blake family mystery endures, as fresh and disturbing as the day 12 people sat down to Sunday dinner and stepped sideways out of existence, leaving the rest of us to wonder not just where they went, but what their disappearance tells us about the nature of reality itself. And here we are, at the edge of a story that has no ending, only an ellipsis stretching into darkness. We've walked through the snow-covered paths of Westmore, stepped across the threshold of that abandoned farmhouse, sifted through evidence that crumbles to nothing in our hands. We've heard the theories, examined the testimony, felt the weight of 12 empty chairs around a dinner table still set for a meal that will never be finished. The Blake family remains suspended in that moment of March 17, 1889, neither dead nor alive, neither here nor there, but somewhere in between, in a place our language has no words to describe. What makes this story so profoundly disturbing isn't the violence. There was none. It isn't the mystery of who did it, because no one did anything, at least not in any way we understand. It's the surgical precision of the absence, the way 12 people were lifted out of existence without disturbing a single thread in the fabric of their daily lives. Food stayed warm on plates. Ink remained wet on paper. A clock stopped at 9:12 a.m., marking the moment when time itself seemed to hiccup and swallow a dozen souls whole. The Blake farmhouse burned to nothing. The path to their door has been reclaimed by forest. Their names appear now only in old records and whispered stories. But the questions they left behind have grown stronger with each passing year, spreading like cracks in ice, threatening to shatter our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. Because if 12 people can vanish during morning prayers, in broad daylight, from a locked house in a tiny town where everyone knows everything about everyone, then what else might be possible? What other impossible things might be waiting in the margins of our ordinary lives? You've walked with us through 135 years of investigation, speculation, and fear. You've seen how a simple farm family became a legend, how their absence became more powerful than any presence could be. You've heard about the footprints that end mid-stride, the voices that echo from empty rooms, the children who play games with their names and come back changed. You've learned that some mysteries don't fade with time. They ferment, growing stranger and more potent with each retelling. But now the question turns to you. What do you make of the Blake family disappearance? Do you side with the rationalists who insist there must be a logical explanation we simply haven't found yet? Perhaps they fled debts or enemies, managing somehow to leave no trace despite the snow, despite the watching neighbors, despite leaving everything they owned behind. Or do you find yourself drawn to darker possibilities? Did they stumble into something ancient and hungry that waits in certain places for the unwary? Were they pulled through some crack in reality, some dimensional weakness that yawns open at precise moments to claim the living? Or maybe you believe something else entirely. Maybe the Blakes found something that the rest of us are still looking for. A door out of this world, a passage to somewhere else, somewhere better or worse or simply different. Maybe they didn't vanish at all, but stepped sideways into a space we can't perceive, where they continue their Sunday morning routine eternally, forever frozen at 9:11 a.m., forever 1 minute away from whatever took them. The truth is, we don't know. After 135 years, countless investigations, and endless speculation, we're no closer to answers than Samuel Witter and Esther Wainwright were when they pushed open that creaking door and found only absence waiting inside. And perhaps that's the real horror, not that terrible things happen, but that they happen in ways that make no sense, follow no rules, and leave no explanation. The Blake family disappearance is a reminder that the universe is stranger than we imagine, that our maps of reality have vast territories marked only with here be dragons. So we leave you with the same questions that have haunted Westmore for over a century. We leave you with 12 empty places at a table, 12 names spoken into darkness, 12 lives that simply stopped mid-sentence without even a period to mark their ending. We leave you with a mystery that refuses to be solved, a wound in the world that refuses to heal, a story that refuses to end because it never properly began. It simply was, and then it wasn't. Now it's your turn to become part of this ongoing mystery. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you have a theory that might finally crack this case? Have you experienced something similar in your own life? A moment when reality seemed to slip, when the impossible brushed against your ordinary world? Does your hometown have its own Blake family, its own unsolved vanishing that defies explanation? We want to hear from you because every story shared, every theory proposed, every connection made, brings us one step closer to understanding what happened on that long ago Sunday morning. Share this video with someone who is a good mystery, someone who isn't afraid to stare into the darkness and admit they don't know what's staring back. Subscribe to our channel if you want to explore more cases where reality breaks down and the impossible becomes undeniable. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows that lurk at the edges of the known world. And if you're feeling particularly brave, if the Blake story has awakened something in you that won't be satisfied with just watching and wondering, then take a trip to Westmore, Vermont. Walk the shores of Lake Willoughby when the mist rises off the water. Stand where the Blake farmhouse once stood and listen to the silence. Speak their names into the darkness: Thomas, Martha, Abigail, Henry Jr., Elijah, Josephine, Little Thomas Jr., Henry Sr., Clara, and their 2 children whose names have been lost to time. See if anything answers back. But remember, in Westmore, some doors don't open with keys or force or even understanding. They open when you're not supposed to be watching, when reality blinks, when the ordinary world reveals the extraordinary darkness that was always there, waiting just beneath the surface. The Blake family learned this lesson in the most final way possible. The question is, what will you learn from their silence? Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of America's most enduring mysteries. Remember to stay curious about the world around you, but also stay careful. Because sometimes the biggest danger isn't what we know is out there in the darkness. It's what we don't know is standing right beside us in the light, waiting for that perfect moment when no one is watching to reveal itself. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your questions sharp, and your mind open to possibilities that might terrify you. Because in a world where 12 people can vanish from a warm kitchen without a trace, anything, absolutely anything, is possible. We'll see you in the next one, if you're still there to see it.